All right,
I'm looking forward to your presentation. Please proceed.
thank you. All right, my name is Mitchell Fundingsland, and this is a project for ethical hacking. So I am a cybersecurity consultant, and I was hired by eCorp to install a new production server. In this network, there was already a pre-installed firewall, CEO PC, web server, DNS server, and 3 different Kali Linuxes. And they were all in their own systems, the trusted network, untrusted network, and the DMZ. For eCorp, I was hired to determine possible vulnerabilities within the production server and web server. Along this, I was also going to provide possible exploits to the production and web server. And some of the tools that I used were Metasploit, Nmap, and John the Ripper. And after this, I sent my completed machines to eCorp and then had any suggestions or closing recommendations. So as you can see here with this network diagram, we have the Kali Linux and the trusted network, CEO PC, and this is where the new production server was installed. And in the DMZ, we have the DNS server, web server, and the Kali Linux. And from this DMZ Kali Linux, we will perform different tests for vulnerabilities and exploits. And so these were just the different installations that I did for installing the production server. As you can see here, it is in the trusted network, and these are just the other virtual machines along with the production server. And so just a general thing I did was just a Nmap scan, which would show potential hosts that were open in the different networks. Even though I was provided a lot of information in regards to the IP address and other things, I was able to do a general Nmap scan to see different hosts were open. And so as you can see to the left, this is for the trusted network. And so the production server is the one that uses the IP of 192.168.0.17. And then here it just shows in general some open ports. Along with the Nmap scan and the DMZ, you can see that the web server that was going to be used for vulnerabilities and tested for exploits is the 10.200.0.12. And so first, I was going to look at the production server. And so besides just getting a general input of what type of ports are open, I wanted to get a more meticulous scan to see some potential services or versions being run. And so what I did was I used this Nmap scan on the left, which is a very fast scan that showed the potential services and versions run on the different ports. And a more in-depth scan, which took a little bit longer, used a script and to test vulnerabilities. And as you can see here, it's very more detailed in terms of showing potential exploits that could be used, such as you can see here with a backdoor or different vulnerabilities, and just would show in greater detail what could essentially be exploited. And so with the first vulnerability that I wanted to identify was with FTP. And so as you can see here circled, there is a version VSFTPD version 2.3.4. And so in this, you could essentially create a backdoor and would provide backward access to this production server. And along this, I also found with the production server an NFS vulnerability, which is the file sharing type of vulnerability, where essentially you could access and mount this NFS server and maybe change specific files. And in a way, you could access the SSH files and change those so you could actually enter in through SSH port. And so as you can see here, this just shows with the RPC info, just the different programs and ports being used. And as you can see here, you have the port 2049, which is open with NFS on both UDP and TCP ports. And as I found these two main vulnerabilities I wanted to exploit on the production server, I then looked for different vulnerabilities on the web server. And so as you can see here, we have a script that was also being run on the web server. And so in this, I was able to find in great detail different vulnerabilities that could be exploited, along with specific information about the versions or services being run on those particular ports. So one of the first vulnerabilities I found on the web server was with Unreal IRCD, and that was on port 6667. And with the vulnerability scan, I found that it was a common scan that different Trojans or different botnets operated on to get that backdoor access into a system. And so wanted to then try to exploit that later. Along this, I also found a port 1099, which was on the web server, which could possibly be exploited. And so in this, it takes advantage of remote code execution. And so then you could execute this code to essentially get access to a system remotely. And so as you can see here, even though there are a lot of vulnerabilities in the server, I just wanted to list some common ones that I found, such as the FTP and both of these servers, the Telnet service, which was open and unsecure, and port 80. There were different vulnerabilities that I found, one using a DDoS attack with Solaris, different possible injections, and then with web crawler was able to find different files that would be accessed through HTTP. And so as you can see here with the Java RMI remote code execution, along with another one, which is a possible SQL injection on port 5432. And so the first thing that I wanted to do as a cybersecurity analyst is trying to exploit the production server. And so for this, I was able to find VSFTP, this version 2.3.4, to gain a backdoor access into the target computer. And so what I did was I utilized Metasploit. And while I was in the MSF console, was able to search for a FTP exploit. And so as I searched, I found right here the exploit being able to run with backdoor, and it had a different ranking as excellent. And so I decided to use that particular exploit. And so what I did was showed the options of the exploit, and it showed that for the R host, which is the target host, I would have to set the IP for that. So I set it to the production service IP. And for the R port, I wanted to use the 21 for the FTP, the file transfer protocol. And so essentially, once I loaded that payload, I then ran the exploit. And as you can see here, I wrote who am I, or typed that, and it shows that I have root access. The next exploit, which was a more complicated exploit I found on port 2049, was where the production server essentially utilized the NFS server, and that this NFS server didn't have any credentials required. So what you could essentially do is create your own file and key and mount that onto the NFS server. And so essentially that key would be the production server's key. And so once you mount your TMP file to that, you can essentially access that SSH through SSH, and there would be no password or authentication required. And so as you can see to the left, just the RPC info command that I put in, which showed the different port numbers and just showing that the NFS was up. And so further helped me to find that I can exploit this server. And so what I did first was I basically used show mount, which basically it would show where the NFS server is mounted. And so as you can see at the bottom, we have the slash, which shows that the NFS server is mounted on the root directory. And so running show mount e and the IP address of the production server, essentially able to see, okay, this is the root server, so a root directory. So what I could do is make my own tmp/nfs directory, and then that'll be the essential point to place my mount. And so furthermore, what I then had to do was enter a longer command, which is essentially mounting onto that NFS server. And basically, after I mount onto it, will basically get that server information onto that tmp/nfs file, which I stored locally. So essentially, I'm getting all this information from the NFS server and mounting it on a local directory. And so with that, I can create my own key through SSH keygen. And so for this, I can use this own key and then access the NFS, or essentially utilize the information to access the SSH with that key and all the information I received from NFS. And so as you can see with this command here, I appended the key, SSH key, onto the NFS root file where the SSH keys are saved on the NFS server. And so after I mounted this and then unmounted, essentially those keys are now in the NFS server. So it will recognize, okay, that these keys will match to the local Kali Linux that I'm using on the DMZ server. So I won't have to put any type of passwords or any authentications that will recognize each other through that public key. And so as you can see here, I did SSH root at the production IP address and was able to essentially have root access and show with the who am I. And so now the next exploit I want to talk about is with the web server, the Unreal IRCD, and that was used for Trojans or some type of backdoor access. And so I saw that through the exploits, and so wanted to take advantage of that. And so as you can see here, I utilized Metasploit and was able to find different exploits with that. And so as you can see here with number 2, I have an Unreal backdoor. And so I could then use those options to find the number 2, this exploit that I wanted to use, and then essentially load it on. And once I loaded it, I was able to find the different R hosts or R ports that need to be set. And so what I did was set the R host to that target IP address, which is now the web server, which is the 10.200.0.12. And so as you can see with this Unreal IRCD, it's a little different in that it also requires an L host, which is the current PC's IP that I'm using. So I had to set both the R host, which is the 10.200.0.12, and then the local host, which is the 10.200.0.10. And so as you can see here, we have that target host, the target port, which is 6667, and then we have the local host 10.200.0.10. And so once I essentially put in those different parameters, I was able to exploit it and create a backdoor in a sense, and that would essentially gave me root access to the system. And so the last exploit, which is with the web server, is through Java RMI. And so that's essentially a vulnerability where there is remote code execution being allowed. And so it's an error with the programming side of Java and the runtime environment. And so now I will do a live demonstration of the Java RMI exploit.
Very good. I'm looking forward to the demo.
Okay, so now that I'm root on the DMZ system, I am going to look at enter essentially the MSF console, which is the Metasploit console. And so as you can see here, once the Metasploit console loads up, I can then search for the particular exploit. So as here, I will search for Java RMI. And I have, so if you see here, you have different options. So you have the auxiliary, which is basically like a scan to see if that would work, and these different exploits. And so for this exploit, I want to use the number 1, so which is the multi-MISC. So I will type in use 1. And so then I can show the options, which will show many of the different parameters. And so for here, I can see, okay, this doesn't have an R host or the target host I need to set. So what I will do is set the R host to the target address, which is the 10.200.0.12. And so then, as you can see with here, I have the R host set and the R port, which is over that 1099. And so knowing that there's also basically a port 80 is open, I could use the server port as port 80. So I can set the server port to 80. And so then you can see here, okay, I have all of these paths open. Oh, but the listening port, that's port 4444, I want to set that to 1099, and that I know that's open. So I will set this port to 1099. And so as you can see here, I have a majority of this information successful. And so the last thing that I would do, just with this particular exploit for the HTTP delay, the time that the HTTP server will wait for the payload, I had success setting this for 15. And so as you can see here, seems like I have all of the essential things set with the R host, the R port, the server port, and make sure that the local host is local and what listening port it's on. And so I will then run the exploit. And so now, as you can see here, it shows the interpreter session 1 is opened. So I can just type get user ID, and then it'll show the root. Or if I wanted to create a shell, and then type in who am I, it would show root, and then I could just show all the different files that I'm able to access with that. And along this, the interpreter shell would actually have more utilities to download different files or systems compared to the normal shell. So usually if I'm able to get that interpreter shell, I would rather prefer that than the other one. So then I will go to, as you can see here, so once I essentially, once I did that exploit, I then looked for different interesting files that I could find within these different systems. And so first within the production server, I was able to find a stuff section, essentially in the MSF admin. There is a stuff and vulnerability or vulnerable section. And so within the stuff section, was able to open that up and see that there's a safe combination text. So then when I further examined that, it showed the whole safe combination saved in clear text. So essentially, if I did one of those exploits, I was able to see in clear text the safe combination and take advantage of that and maybe go to the particular building and use that safe combination code. As you can see here, also within the production server, and within the vulnerable file, we have a MySQL SSL, which could essentially have the SQL keys, and then the Samba and TikiWiki, which is essentially just the files within the HTTP that I found with HTTP enum. So essentially these open files and different things on the website that you could access that could provide more information to an attacker. And so within the interesting files I found with the web server, it had saved under admin the same type of files with the MySQL, Samba, and different TikiWiki. And within the Jasper section, which was a user, I found that they had a candidate list and a social media security policy. And at first, this wouldn't seem a big deal, but I found that Jasper saved the candidate list along with their personal identifiable information, along with their social security number, date of birth, names, etc. And this could be very valuable information for an attacker, who could essentially sell this information to the highest bidder. Or maybe in regards to the social media policy, just have information about the company and what type of policies or procedures they are doing, whether it's insider information or just something that can maybe help or hurt the business. And so this was just another example of showing that maybe if somebody was in the system or just a general user, they could use these commands to create a user which could then have root access to the system. And so for this example, I used the username Bobby. And so if I'm able to do this so easily, I could then essentially go back into the system and log in as Bobby, which didn't have that much of a password requirement. And so for the last part, I wanted to utilize John the Ripper to see if I could crack any passwords within the production server. So as you can see here, we have the etc password file and etc shadow file. And both of these files are very important for John the Ripper to use, and that to combine them in one file and to ultimately use that to find different passwords. And a lot of times this would be available mainly to root users. So if you have that remote access and root access, you're able to access these. And so what I did was, even though I could have downloaded the files, I saved them to a text document and then combined them as one. So once I did that, I combined both of these files into the home/pwd.txt. And so what I did was essentially run John, which was the program John the Ripper, and it learned to use this home/pwd.txt to look up these files. And so as you can see here, these are some of the passwords that were cracked, along with some users that I added also. So once I saw that only 5 or 6 passwords were cracked, I decided to look if, say, maybe there was a different word list that I could use that could maybe crack more passwords. And so then what I did was use a word list for RockU, which used a different combination of words. And essentially, once I used this word list, was able to crack a little bit more passwords. As you can see here, there is only one password at the end, which I guess reverted to brute force, which could have taken a little bit longer time, but was more successful using this RockU word list. And so one of the closing remarks I would say is for authentication for these ports and processes are very important. And that for the NFS server, for example, it was rooted at the root server. And so there wasn't some type of authentication for that NFS. And so I was able to easily mount or unmount, which could be a big problem. Along that, different ports were using unsecure protocols, and that FTP, there's a more secure protocol, whether it's FTPS or SFTP. And along that, also with HTTP, there could be port 443 for HTTPS. And a lot of these files could be encrypted. And essentially they were all saved in clear text with headers that could identify what they were for, such as the password, safe combination.txt, or maybe a central candidate list, and different things that could be very easy for somebody to find. And so understanding that a lot of these systems of production server and the web server had these different ports open, I would say that some of these ports that aren't essential could essentially be closed, or the services running on those ports, and that some things may only be essential for certain businesses, so you wouldn't need everything open, as many ports as were open here. And along with that, using stronger, longer passwords, because these passwords are very easy to crack with brute force. As the John the Ripper saw that a lot of the passwords were words or passwords such as password, which are very easy to crack in seconds. And so then the one user that wasn't able to crack using brute force was probably a lot longer and more complicated, which shows that saving stronger, longer passwords are very important. And so again, what I would recommend is maybe using a port that would transfer over TLS and encrypted tunnel. And essentially, if you're not using the port, you would just want to make sure that it's closed. And to make sure that with these versions, a lot of the versions are not updated and could be years old. And so the older they are, potentially the more vulnerabilities they could have. And so I would suggest updating different protocols, different ports, different things that would essentially make it a lot harder for an attacker to find vulnerabilities. And so one of the things I would recommend doing is if you have important documents or files saved, even if they are at a very secure place, such as within root, you just would maybe name them a different thing that wouldn't be as clear as day as passwords or keys. You could maybe use different numbers or text, so then it could essentially be camouflaged in a file with similar files or documents that may not seem particularly important, but could dissuade attacker. And also, a lot of these files could be encrypted in a way. You can use different forms of encryptions or hashes to essentially make sure that these are inaccessible to people without that proper access. And so I would just use these more strict authentication protocols, and just going back to the different protocols such as the NFS with not requiring that type of authentication. Yep.
Very good, Mitchell. That was a wonderful presentation. Great job, my friend.
Thank you.